Okay, we are live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on how to build integrations that customers love. My name is Liz Garcia. I'm on the marketing team at Pandium, which is hosting this event for you all. And before handing things over to our workshop host, Natalie, just a couple housekeeping things. We're going to take a Q&A at the end of the event. If you have questions, you can leave them in the chat slash comments of the LinkedIn events page. And then any templates and resources that Natalie is going to be sharing or talking about during the event, we're going to share those at the last slide of the event. And also, if you registered, we'll be sending those straight to your email inbox. With that being said, I'm going to hand things over to our workshop host, Natalie.
Hey everyone, so excited to be here speaking. I'm a senior product manager here at Pandium. I've been working with SaaS companies for about 10 years so far, mainly working on the integration process, development process, and I've been working specifically on integrations and product design, project management, and that scope for 7 years, both on a implementation CX side and also on the product management side. Also, as a fun fact, I used to be a karaoke host for many, many years, and I'm really excited to just dive into all of this with you. So with that, let's get started. So we're basically going to walk you through what every step of the integration, design, and development process looks like. Well, less for the development, but for the design and scoping and figuring out what you need to do. So with that, we're going to figure out the framing first. So why leverage a design thinking approach when building integrations? So, a few things. One, we want to make sure that it's an integration that your customers actually want. We want to make sure it's an integration that your customers actually need. And then beyond that, we want to make sure that it takes into account the scalability and the adaptability of your product and your platform and your customers. So, an ideal integration, when we're thinking about framing it, we want to make sure, and we'll get into all of this later, that it's useful for your company, for your stakeholders, and for your users. With that, there's a few different types of integrations that you'll want to be thinking about with this. Integrations are just like people; they're all different. They're all shapes and sizes. They all have different preferences and needs. So we have really, really lightweight integrations that are mostly just zipping data across. Sometimes one way, sometimes two ways. Very little configuration needed. Very standard. And then we have really, really crazy in-depth integrations. And you can think about something like NetSuite or Salesforce, where it has to be really, really highly customized. Every customer has a different account. Going into it, you might think that those are very custom integrations. And that could be a path you go down in the end, but it doesn't need to be. So when we're thinking about integrations and what integrations we want to build, we want to prioritize the user needs, the scalability, and adaptability. We don't just want to think about the technical execution. We really want to think about empathizing with the users. We want to think about defining the challenges they have, figuring out what that solution would look like and how we'll get there, as well as prototyping and iterating moving forward. So as you can see at the bottom of the screen, we have all of those mapped out that we're going to talk about. We have the intro here, and then the user research, design, prioritization, and then build. So let's dive straight into it. So first, we're going to get started by asking the big questions. And with the big questions, we have the big questions, the macro focus, and then the slightly smaller big questions, the micro focus. So one, what prompted the need for a new integration? Why do you need it now? So this is a really good thing to think about when you're in a product role and you're hearing from the sales team, hey, we're missing out on these deals because we're missing integrations. Or you're hearing from the CX team, hey, these customers might not be sticky enough or they're a churn risk because we're missing these integrations. And then you as a product person say, hey, I'm noticing a gap in our product. We could potentially integrate with another product itself to fix that. So with that, you really want to focus on, why do you need it now? which one of those is going to help you the most in the short term, and then prioritize out what it's going to help in the long term. What are your broader business goals? Are you trying to move up market? Are you trying to move down market? Different integrations and different products will attract different types of customers. Are you going towards Salesforce and NetSuite and larger, more bespoke or more flexible integrations? That would be more enterprisey. Are you trying to just zip data across in a very standard format? That might be a down market move, or it could be very aligned with what you currently have. Are you trying to adopt a new industry or a new vertical? Obviously, different products are catered to different industries and different types of companies. So that's one thing that you want to take into consideration as well. For the micro focus, who are you building this for? So that's when we're thinking about the personas and segments. So we want to think about admin users, day-to-day users. We also want to think about, is this going to be an internal integration? Is it going to be an external integration? What are their needs and frustrations? Would building this integration solve these? This, I think, is actually one of the more important questions, because something I've seen repeatedly in my career is people say something along the lines of, hey, people need to connect their accounting software. Let's connect with QuickBooks. One, are your customers using QuickBooks? Are they using another software? I know that sounds very obvious, but it's something to consider. Two, even if you needed to integrate, or if you think you need to integrate with QuickBooks, would integrating with that actually solve that problem? When you're looking at the customer gap, that's a really in-depth thing to figure out and kind of weigh the pros and cons of potentially building out more capabilities within your product or just integrating into another system to solve these ideas. And also, when you're thinking about integrating with another system to help tackle some of these solutions, you need to be prepared to think about if the way that your product works and the way that the API for your product works is actually going to make it capable to integrate with another system to solve these problems. So in a QuickBooks example, you need to make sure that you actually have some way of tracking and showing that accounting data or APIs to actually receive that information and to export that information out in a smart way. So that's something we'll also dive down into in the design process. But these are all things that you want to consider before kind of diving down into the road, thinking about who needs it, why do you need it? Is an integration actually going to solve this problem, or is it just another thing that you're going to have to tackle on and maintain? And how we can address those problems moving down the road. So getting into the user research section, I hinted on this earlier, but there's three main components when you're thinking about user research. You have the stakeholders. So when I think about stakeholders, I'm normally thinking about, for the most part, my internal team. So CEO, CTO, the engineering team, the CX team, or potentially even a board. So those are people who you're going to have to report to. They're probably going to want specific goals hit, and they're going to want you like tackling those. So for example, gaining sales or reducing churn. And then on the other side of that, you have a partner manager or a point of contact. So for example, if you're building into QuickBooks, you probably want to talk to someone at QuickBooks and get that rolling. One thing that I have also encountered that I would never recommend is a lot of companies saying, hey, we just want to integrate with everyone. We're going to use a unified API, or we're just going to use their public API docs and just build an integration. While that is useful in the sense that you get an integration, there's normally often a lot of issues with that route. One, you're not going to be getting the best support. you're not going to be able to use them as a resource, and you're not going to be able to know about any specific processes or protocols that you might want to implement. For example, certain companies, if you're building an at scale integration that you want to send out to 50 customers, that's going to have a very different process and look a lot different if you're just building it like internally for your own use case. And a lot of those public API docs are for like an individual use case. So if you are integrating with a product, one of the first things that I really highly recommend you do before going down that road is actually talking to someone from that product, making sure that you develop that relationship, because just like anything in life, that relationship is really going to help open those doors and make it a much more better and holistic integration. And then, of course, the highlight here is the users themselves. So you're going to want to definitely schedule some different meetings with users. Ideally, you could get some meetings or at least take the notes from sales calls that are coming in, existing users of the product, maybe even people who left the company or customers who churned if you still have an existing relationship with them. And you're going to want to tackle this on two sides. One, just getting that initial feedback of what they would be looking for, and then making sure that you have people lined up for a beta implementation of the integration once it's actually live. And the beta part, I really, really cannot emphasize enough, because another thing I've seen a lot of times is you've built this integration, you kind of have this plan for people, automatically integrating with it and getting it live. But two things there. One, it might have a much slower uptick than you imagine if you're trying to do it kind of naturally. And two, a lot of integrations need a live user in order for the product manager or the engineers to actually see what is happening. Because in any QA or development process, you're going to be going through all the scenarios, making sure that you have a happy flow, maybe trying to tackle some of those edge cases. But just like anything in life, edge cases and problems are going to pop up in ways that you don't expect, because people and technology themselves tend to be, to some degree, unique and unexpected. And I believe with stakeholders, I also did mention the sales team, but I just want to once again emphasize on that you really want to align with any sales or rev gen marketing team. And the marketing ties into the beta component with the users as well. Something that I've seen before that I really, really love is if you have a marketplace or even just on your listserv, you can have like a coming here component for that integration. So while you're going to be proactively searching for customers who have already said that they might be interested in this integration or product, you really want to also try and collect as much information as who might be interested in that product naturally. So kind of tackling it on two different fronts, proactively searching for people, and then also having a place for them to, discover it on their own and express their interest, so you can hit them up as soon as that comes out live. And I've been talking a lot of this about kind of if you have an integration in mind, who you should be talking to. And that's for the most part how we're going to move forward with the rest of this presentation, is with a singular integration in mind. But when you're first trying to figure out what integration to build, these are also the stakeholders and also the people that you want to talk to. You need to collect all of this information for several integrations at first to figure out which one you want to build first, and then how to prioritize them further down the line. So once again, talking more about gathering that specific feedback. As I mentioned, you're going to want to conduct user interviews to gather the feedback and help determine the specific use cases for the integration. One of my favorite questions that I love asking users in any like product feedback gathering session is, what is your pie in the sky example? I love this because it ties into the next point, which is the asking open-ended questions. With pie in the sky, you can always say, if technology, if money, if any of that was no limit in an integration to a specific product, once again, let's say QuickBooks, for example, what would you like to see? What would you like to do? What is your ideal use case? Like what is your dream? And I think with that, it's a really great question because customers can kind of customers, prospects, users, they can say whatever they want. And that also kind of helps cross the barrier of users only feeding you back what they think might be possible. But what I also like to say is nothing is necessarily impossible. So we might as well aggregate all that information and take it back and see what we can do. So following up with that, once again, ask open-ended questions. So an example of that might be instead of asking, do you need a transaction flow, saying, what type of information do you need back and forth? They might say that in different ways. They might say, we need accounting information or we need transactions, or they might say, I specifically need my youth t-shirts account in QuickBooks going into my youth t-shirts. So you know what I'm saying. They might say it in different ways, but asking open-ended questions is going to get the most information from the widest breadth of users. Once again, staying away from yes/no questions. You really want your users to be able to further explain themselves if they do have thoughts on that. And then, of course, the best way is ask them to screen share or walk through frustrations. I love this for two reasons. One, you can get a better idea of what the users are actually talking about. Once again, language is not necessarily binary. People can express things and concepts in different ways, but if you are on a screen share with them, you can actually see what they mean. And you can also understand what their workflow looks like based off of how they use that product and how they utilize it. The other reason I really love this is with any integration that you're building, you do, to a degree, need to become an expert not only on your own product, but also on the product that you're integrating with. So especially if you might not be that familiar going into it with that product, having screen shares and walkthroughs with different customers really helps set you in that direction. So you're better understand what a day-to-day life looks like when using that product, get a better idea of what it looks like and what it does. And then the next big area in gathering feedback, review relevant feature requests. So something that I hope all customers do is collecting feature requests, both from their end users and also from internally from other members of the company, even if it's just, a Google Doc that lives in the back of your mind most of the time. When you're gathering feedback like this, it's a really great time to go look at that feedback list, that request list, and look at everything that has ever come up regarding integrations or this one specific product. Or even if it doesn't specifically mention integrations or third-party product, it could just be like, I wish we had a better way to manage accounts, or we had a better way to manage transactions. Try to think broadly and collect everything that could potentially be related to this integration ask and gather it in, and then you can always further divvy it out. And then that goes into our next slide. So how I like sorting through all of that feedback and information that we have. So I'm going to focus on these three components: distilling, grouping, and prioritizing. So one, I said in the last slide, gather everything that you can. So that's where the distilling is going to come from. So once you've gathered everything that might be vaguely relevant to this integration, you're going to go through and say, okay, this seems maybe doable. That's something we're interested in. And then cut out everything else. Don't delete it, just, move it to a different page. From there, you're going to go in and group it. So you're going to take a look at everything that you've gathered from the customers, figure out what is similar. So with feature requests, maybe some of the feature requests that are internal are very aligned with things that your users are saying. Maybe you had 5 users say that you need something around transactions, or, a specific custom action. So you're going to take those and then group them. And then from there, you can prioritize. So once you have the grouping, then a really good and easy way to prioritize is one, take a look at which group or container has the most item actions, which item you've heard the most from your different users and which one has been requested most. The one thing I will say with prioritizing is, of course, it's not solely based off of what is the most requested thing. That's a good way to start going in, but as we go deeper into the slides, we'll also talk about how we can weigh requested components versus level of technical effort and what the practicality of going into that looks like, and comparing MVPs and further iterations of the integration. But as far as just getting started, distill, group, prioritize. So now we're starting to get into the more nitty gritty of the overall integration design. So a really good way to think about it is starting with the overall business use case. Then from there, you're going to have discrete use cases that are still being handled by that integration. And then underneath that, independent data flows that will help address and tackle those use cases. So with the business case, what is the goal? What is the main thing that you're trying to solve here? So this is going to be thinking back to the beginning of the conversation here, or it might be your product has a gap that would best be solved by an integration. For something, once again, just going back to QuickBooks, for something like that, the use case might be our customers need to have records of their transactions coming into our product. Define use cases, user stories. What happens in this, when this happens in this platform, then why should happen downstream? So a lot of this is pretty standard to a product manager. Very much as a user, this happens, and then I expect to see X or something along those lines. That's how you want to handle the use case story, the use case component. So for example, when I create a new transaction in QuickBooks, I expect to see it in Acme Co. When I edit a transaction in Acme Co, I expect to see those changes made in QuickBooks. So break those down discreetly. And then after you've identified those individual use cases and stories, then you're going to start thinking about the data flow. And something that is really important with this is points of, like, the point of truth. So for example, if things are changing back and forth, there might be instances where you want to say, okay, QuickBooks is going to be the point of truth. This is where everything should be accurate all the time. This is what I'm reading off of. And that is especially really important when you're doing one-way integrations. Two ways can be a little bit trickier. You might have two different points of truth for different data points. But also when you're looking at the data originating, and we're going to, again, speak on this a little bit further in slides, but you're really going to want to look at the individual components for both your product and then also the product that you're integrating with. So going into beginning the design work, what is possible? So documentation mindset. The first thing I want to point out here is any documentation that you're creating for an integration is going to be a living and breathing document. You're going to write something now, and then during the refinement process, during the development process, during the QA and beta period, this is going to be updated as you are figuring out what works, what doesn't really work, and or if you need to do any creative workarounds. So first, document first approach. Make sure that you write it down. Review it, write it down again, and then review it more. Identifying triggers. So that's a really big one when it comes to integrations. How is this integration going to function? Is it going to be webhook based? Is it going to be polling based? Is it going to be both polling and webhook based? As a bit of an aside, I would just say that if you are using webhooks, I do very much recommend in every situation also having some polling component. Webhooks can be a bit unstable and undependable. So if you are doing webhooks, which I think is awesome, as real time as we can get, I would highly recommend that you do also have a polling function going back to just make sure that you did receive all of that data. And then with polling, and then kind of with webhooks, but mostly with polling, you're going to have to figure out that frequency. So is this integration running every hour? Is it running every 10 minutes? Do you want to give your customers options of when it can run? And then more granular than that, if you have different data flows, is one data flow running every hour? Is one of those flows running every 15 minutes? So when you're thinking about those triggers and frequency, you don't just want to look at the integration as a whole, but you really want to apply that mindset and these questions to every specific use case and data flow as well. Going in further, the API capabilities. What endpoints can support these data flows? So this is something that you really have to do for every integration. You need to go into the API documents and see what is available. Going into the API documents and seeing what is available, honestly, might be a deal breaker for some smaller, newer systems. But again, that's a really good point to talk about if you do have and you have developed that partner relationship, bringing up that, hey, we really want to integrate with you guys, but we don't see these API endpoints. Can we work together to make this work for both of us? And that's another bonus to having that developed relationship. But with looking at the endpoints, you really want to dive into the field mappings there. So making sure that you have a one-to-one relationship or a one-to-many relationship for all of the fields that you're going to be mapping. And this is normally a time where you do uncover some of those potential gaps in the platform. Maybe a really critical field for your product is just something that the product that you're integrating with doesn't have any understanding of. If so, what are some workarounds? Can you create a custom field or a different field for that use? So there's a lot of different ideas there. If you're less familiar with building integrations and you do get into a tricky spot like that, I would definitely say reach out to someone who is more advanced in this field. And I'm sure that they have some experience with some creative workarounds. And again, if this is something that you're going to encounter, make sure it's documented. Have a section in your documentation that's, oddities, peculiarities, or something else. And then for the last component, what are system limitations, rate limits? So this is a really good question if you are So this is a really good question in general, but especially if you're going to be polling really, really frequently or be handling a ton of data. Are there rate limits? Can you do things in bulk? Can you do multiple requests at the same time? Can you utilize concurrency? So these are all things that you probably will have to pull your technical team into, even if you don't need to right away just to think about these things. At a minimum, when you finish this initial first version of documentation, you definitely want to take it to the technical team who will be building this and have them review it and get their thoughts. Is there anything that looks concerning to them? And then here is when you can really get that level of effort involved for each specific use case, as well as the specific data flows. And then from here, you can identify what is the MVP? What are the nice to haves? And this is also something that you're going to put into that initial documentation. So once you have everything, then you're going to review it with the tech team and yourself. And then from there, you can just move around those different components and say, this is critical. This is easy. We're definitely going to do it. This is kind of important, but it's going to be a heavier lift. Maybe we add that into a V1 or V2. So this is what we call the scope doc, doing the initial work to figure this out. And then that's going to eventually transform into the spec doc, which is the actual real specs of the integration. So once again, designing the workflows, mind the gap. So we talked about this a little bit, but as I said, you're going to dive into those field mappings. You're going to specifically list out every endpoint that you're going to use for each flow, and figure out if there are any gaps there and what potential solutions or workarounds would be. And again, you're going to have that reviewed with your team, make sure they get level of effort, and you're going to break it down really specifically. So this is a lot of things I said with the last slide, but with more emphasis on the tech side, and then also a little example from a Pandium spec doc. So when we are doing scoping and specs, we do include all of this information, not only because it's good to have from the get-go, but it's going to help your engineers develop it. And then also it's going to be incredibly useful later on when you're doing troubleshooting or reviewing this with your CX team. We also touched upon this a little bit, but we're going to talk a little bit more about MVP versus V2 plus integrations and iterations and narrowing the scope. So of course, the biggest thing is, what is the business criticals versus the nice to haves? When you talk to your users and they were saying that they want this integration, what is the one thing that they need in this integration, or else it's completely pointless? That is what your MVP is going to do. With the MVP, depending on how heavy a lift it is and when you want to get this integration out, you can also include some nice to haves. But if it does seem like there is, if the MVP with the business critical is going to be, 2 weeks of development, or even so, kind of another tangent, but in general, a very quick and dirty integration probably shouldn't take you more than 2 weeks. A very, very in-depth integration, something like NetSuite, the first version shouldn't take you more than 3 months. If you're spending more than, let's say, 2 to 4 weeks for a simple integration and more than 3 months on a complex integration for the first iteration, that is a warning sign right there that you're including too much in your MVP. And that's also a really good rule of thumb. So when you spec it out with your tech team, if your business critical components are going to take longer than that time frame, then do another iteration for the nice to haves. If you can include those nice to haves and kind of pretty easily with the basic scope, then just throw them in. And that'll be a nice thing that you can test out with the beta. If not, just do iterations, V1, V2, and then roll them out as you go. Also, where iterations come in is especially with more complex use cases for something like Salesforce or NetSuite. You probably have new customers coming in that can use the majority of the functionality of those integrations, but might have not necessarily a custom use case, but a more bespoke use case. And that can also lead into a further conversation about tackling specific verticals. And right there, generic versus custom, getting ahead of myself. In my mind, almost every integration can be a generic integration. There are definite use cases where you 100% need a very custom integration, especially if you're integrating with a company that, built their own internal ERP system or something bonkers like that. And that's normally for a more established, older enterprise company. But when we're talking about custom here, we're talking about something like Salesforce or NetSuite. And when we say custom, that means building it in a way that is generic for all of your customers, but offering a lot of configuration settings where your customers can fully customize that in whatever way they want. And this is also something that you should include when you're thinking about the use case and the technical reviews. So for example, if you have like 6 different data flows, you can allow your customers to toggle those on and off. So certain customers might only need certain data flows. If you're going to do field mapping, rather than having static mapping, consider doing dynamic mapping, where your customers can do set those mappings by themselves. For scheduling, if you do need different flows to live on different schedules, consider allowing your customers to set those schedules by themselves. These are all things that are 100% capable with intelligent code and using if-else statements. And I would definitely utilize that, because in the grand scheme, you're looking at scaling one more generic with custom component integration than building out 10 completely custom integrations. It's really just going to save you a lot of time and effort in the long run. And again, if that's too much for the first time, you can always build that into a further iteration. And then, of course, when you're looking at MVPs and further iterations, look at the data, consider the level of effort. So materials for implementation. We spoke to these a little bit, but one, you're going to have a scope doc. Depending on what your specific position is in these organizations, you might potentially get a scope doc from a partner or someone that you're building the integration with. For example, if you're building into QuickBooks, there's a chance QuickBooks might say, okay, you need to include these specific things. So the scope doc is when you're aggregating everything, when you're presenting it to engineering. The spec doc is going to be the active, living, breathing document that specs out everything that is actually included in the integration in every iteration, if you have built further iterations. And this document will be available via a QR code at the end of the presentation, and also can be, we can send it to you as well as you hit us up. And then we also have a testing and criteria template. That sounds maybe a little bit fancy, but basically it's a QA doc. Things that should be included in here include load testing, edge cases. So for example, historical data / moving forward, maybe different accounts. You really want to try and cram as many potential edge cases and use cases in here as possible. I think we will have a little bit of time, so as long as I can figure out sharing my screen without creating complete chaos, I'll do a little teaser of what these look like. But from there, you're going to allow anyone looking at this template to say, you're going to write what steps they should be taking. They're going to say what they did, if it passed, if it failed, and if there's anything of note in how it worked or didn't work there. I also highly recommend creating 2 copies of this template, one for internal testing and then one for external testing. What do I mean by external? If you are working with a partner, they might potentially want to do their own testing for the integration. They might have their own use cases, but it doesn't hurt to provide them with one. If it goes into beta, you might want to do that with them. And my wonderful Liz on the marketing team reminded me that this isn't an hour, it's only 45 minutes. So I'm actually not going to share those right now, but we can give them to you at the end, and they'll go out with the recording and the follow-up email. So once again, here are those QR codes to immediately get access to our spec doc. And then the second QR code is to download our guide to product management for SaaS integrations. So these are all resources that we happily provide to everyone. Feel free to hit us up if you have any questions about them. And then in general, are there any questions that anyone would like me to answer in the last minute or two?
Yeah, so we got one. I'm going to share it in the chat. But this person asked, we talked about internal documentation around integrations. Can you share any tips or pitfalls for documenting integrations for end users?
Yeah, totally. So one thing that I would definitely mention is, it seems a little silly, but make sure you document installing the integration. If there's any weird provisioning, how you get the API keys, something like NetSuite has like really, really crazy permissioning. So make sure you document all of that. And the best way to document that is by having someone in your internal team go through and figuring out where they fail. If there are kind of any gotchas in the actual integrations, that's where the QA spreadsheet really comes in helpful, because you're going to be covering a lot of those different use cases, and you can take a lot of that in documentation for end users. And this isn't exactly your answer, but something I also really like doing with spec sheets is also including for internal CX members kind of useful gotchas that might come up in the integration. And then those can also be translated for the end user. For example, if you're getting this error, this is a very common reason for why you got that.
Nice. Thank you, Natalie. We're at time, and so thank you everyone who tuned in live, and thank you everyone who is going to listen or watch the recording at a later time. Like Natalie said, the templates that she's been actively talking about, they're on the screen, but we're also going to share them in the follow-up with the registrants.